You're listening to Spotlight, the podcast that fosters connections with veterans and military spouses. Here's your host, Bob Louthan.
Welcome, everybody. This is your host, Bob Louthan, and this is the Spotlight on the VeteranCrowd Network. I have so many questions today for our guest. I'm really excited. This guy is perhaps a best analogy I can use is that he's a real life Jack Ryan. I'm gonna ask him a little bit about Tom Clancy and all of these things, but Robert Williscroft, welcome to the program. Thank you for stepping into the spotlight.
Well, it's my pleasure.
So we've met. Robert's son, Jason, is Naval Academy grad and veteran himself, and very pleased to have met you through the Ring Knockers program, and been very active in that. And it's just great to have you as a guest. Gosh, I don't even know where to start, so I just have to start asking questions. Let's go back, and it's just such a pleasure to have somebody who's a Cold War warrior on the program with me. But tell us a little bit about growing up, and then we're going to get into Operation Ivy Bells to start with. So, but just tell me about how you ended up getting in the Navy in the first place.
Okay. My folks were missionaries in Germany. They actually went to Poland, the German part of Poland, before the Second World War, escaped by the skin of their teeth, and I was born with my sister in Montana. And in 1950, we went back to Europe with my parents, and I grew up first in Switzerland and then in Germany. Spent my entire growing up time there, going to German schools and learning German, becoming a little German boy, which was really kind of concerning to my parents. Anyway, I ended up at the right around 1960, late 1960, back in the United States. I had been really interested in the space program, wanted very, very much to be an astronaut. And in order to do that in those days, you had to be a test pilot. And so I looked around and decided the Navy had the best route to becoming a test pilot. And it turned out that my eyes wouldn't let me do it. A big disappointment. So I immediately cast about and discovered the submarine service. I'd had some contact with it earlier in England in the mid 1950s. My folks had visited Bath, England, and the British Navy had a display. The submarine service had a display there in the Commons area. There's this old British submariner, and he had a tent set up, and he had a periscope set up. I spent lots of hours leaning over that periscope, pretending that I was out at sea battling the bad guys. In any case, I ended up as a submarine sonar technician, kind of like Jonesy in Hunt for Red October. Only difference between Jonesy and me is that he had a black face and I had a light face, but we were both of us precocious. I got picked up for the NECEP program. That is, for some of you who haven't been around as long as I have, the Navy Enlisted Scientific Education Program, which put me through a degree at the University of Washington. I came out with a degree in marine physics and atmospheric physics and went back into submarines as an officer. One thing led to another. I was not nuclear power trained because the needs of the Navy pushed me into a weapons program. And so ultimately I opted out of the submarine service and ended up through a series of completely fortunate circumstances in the Man in the Sea program. And that was the beginning of an absolutely incredible series of events in my life that culminated ultimately in my doing the things that are recorded in Operation Ivy Bells.
Let's talk about that. Take us back to, I guess, about 1970 and tell everybody the story of Operation Ivy Bell. And for the folks that are listening on the podcast, the image behind Robert on the video is that of the USS Halibut. And so let's take us back to about 1970 and tell us what's going on.
Well, to give just a little bit of background canvas to the story, a Navy officer and his kid were up in Chesapeake Bay out in a boat doing some fishing on a weekend, and they happened to notice a sign over on the shore with a big arrow pointing down that said, "Do not anchor here, submerged cables." And that stuck in his head. He got to thinking about it, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized, all over the world, especially in places like the Soviet Union, especially in places like the Sea of Okhotsk, which is between Kamchatka Peninsula, where their largest submarine base was, and the mainland Siberia, there are underwater cables. He got to thinking about it. He started talking with people. And when it was all over, a top secret program was funded. The Halibut was an aging guided missile submarine that really was not good for much of anything. She was overhauled, and a DSRV, a deep submergence rescue vehicle mock-up, was placed on her stern. Now I gotta interrupt my story to go back and add a side branch to all of this. The Navy had been experimenting with saturation diving because it was something that seemed like it would have applications. It obviously had applications in the oil industry, but there were people in the Navy who thought that we might be able to use it too. And over time, the Navy came up with a complete saturation diving program with people going down to near 1,000 feet, breathing exotic gases. And at the same time, parallel to this, we were developing the concept for somehow finding cables and tapping into them in the Sea of Okhotsk. The two programs merged, and we needed a vehicle to do it. Well, the Navy had been talking about creating a submarine rescue system. And ultimately, the Navy did it. It was called the Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle System. These are 6,000 foot diving capable small submarines that can be carried by a mothership. And we had two of those big catamaran motherships, and I served on both of them at one time or another.
We're going to go back to, the Hunt for Red October here. So we've got Jonesy, but they had the DSRV in that movie.
They did. Well, in any case, you see, as I'm sure you know, and probably most of our viewers know, submarines don't operate in waters that are 6,000 feet or less. They tend to operate in waters that are way more than 6,000 feet. And our submarines can't survive more than, some depth less than 2,000 feet. So why in the world were we creating this incredible submarine rescue system to rescue crews off of submarines that never operate where they can be rescued from? Well, the simple answer was we needed a credible cover in order to put what looked like a DSRV on the back of a couple of submarines like the Halibut in order to go into the Sea of Okhotsk, lock divers out on the ocean bottom, and tap into their unencrypted underwater communications cable.
You even had to have a cover story for the cover story, because when you went in to look for the cable, the cover story was that you were looking for missile parts.
And in fact, we did pick up missile parts while we were out there. Interestingly, it wasn't at the same spot. It was a little bit further north in the Sea of Okhotsk. But when President Reagan and Gorbachev had their summit in Reykjavik, at one point, Reagan was able to explain with pictures and diagrams exactly why their latest missile didn't work, what was wrong with their guidance system, which was kind of, I guess, a negative.
Pretty strong negotiating point, huh?
It certainly is.
And literally in these waters, I mean, you're sneaking underneath the Russian Navy.
Exactly. We spent time shadowing directly beneath a couple of cruisers that the Russians routinely kept in the Sea of Okhotsk, and we used them as a cover to get where we wanted to go.
What is the depth there that you were working in, though? How deep are these cables that you were seeking?
The cables that we tapped into were at about 600 feet. The missile parts were between 400 and 800 feet.
I got it. Okay. And going back to your previous point, had the Russians literally put markers, don't anchor here on the coastline?
The way we found them, we cruised along the coastline about 3 miles or so off, far enough to where we were reasonably secure. And we simply slowly and carefully scanned the coastline until we saw the sign.
Look here. Okay. All right. So, and you are a diver. literally placing these devices, and I guess the first listening device was fairly rudimentary, but you went back and replaced it with something far more significant. Am I
Yeah,
correct?
that's correct. The first one was a simple pod. It used magnetic coupling to get the information out, and we listened to it live. We had a group of spooks on board. In fact, we even had a UNIVAC computer, an old UNIVAC computer, up in the forward room of the submarine, and they did a live analysis of what was coming in. Uh, After we put skids on the bottom of the submarine so that we could more comfortably sit on the bottom. Uh, Before that, we couldn't do that really. We had to somehow anchor ourselves suspended over the bottom, and that produced problems that I talk about in the book. But then we went back and we emplaced a 12,000-pound pod, great big guy. It was attached to the bottom of the submarine with a net. We lowered it down. We used floats to float it from the sub over to the cable, and then attached it to the cable and made sure.
And all this is sort of being done manually with divers at 600-700 feet.
Yep.
So let's take a step back. I mean, it's just fascinating to me. It never dawned on me that we even had that capability. Um, how did we discover that? What was the learning process? And you talked about the mixture of gases. They took helium to replace the nitrogen so that you wouldn't get the rapture of the deep, I think is what we used to call it in diving class.
Right.
But so did you have microphone communications when you were down there? I mean, did you sound like Mickey Mouse when you were talking to each other with all that helium in your lungs?
Well, you're dealing with the short answer is yes. The longer answer is there are two effects when you are diving. Depth alone changes the vocal cords and causes the voice to become distorted. And as you pointed out, the helium, the speed of sound is much faster in helium, and so you get distortion from that. And what we used were throat mics, and it went through a descrambler. Now this is back in the 70s. Understand, this is
Right.
not. This is
We're
not
still analog here.
technology. Yeah,
It's all
but
analog.
we were able to put it through a descrambler, and we could be fairly well understood. And even speaking to each other when we were back in the habitat on the halibut, in order to understand one another at that kind of depth, it would go through the scrambler into the other guy's ears.
I mean, did you almost get caught? I mean, you had to have had some close calls. I mean, but the Russians, the Soviets were not even suspicious.
They had no idea. It was until Pelton put the word out and told them about it, they did not have a clue. Where we ran into problems were Mother Nature. So we're operating at 400 to 500 feet. The submarine is suspended on two anchors from the bow and the stern, suspended maybe 30 feet or so off the bottom. And we had a storm up on the surface that was actually ripped one of the anchor cables, tore it. And the submarine ended up at a significant angle, and the divers had to go out and reattach a new anchor cable and get her back to an even keel.
This is dangerous work.
Well, that's why the divers got paid a little bit more money. But they would have done it. They would have paid to do it. You got to understand that.
So,
I mean, ask yourself in this world, where can you do something that is high adventure, that you're at risk, that you're protecting your country, all in one package, and then people pay you for it?
This is fascinating stuff. So I was thinking about this leading up to our conversation, Robert, and Tom Clancy has written all these novels. He's got Jack Ryan. You've written the novels with Mac McDowell, but Clancy had to do research and ask people. He was never in the military. You actually lived it. I mean, I think you even allude to the fact, did you meet Tom Clancy at some point, or were you at an event?
I did not meet him. No, I would like to have. I am aware with some of my connections about how Tom Clancy did a lot of his plotting. He had a retired senior chief petty officer, a submariner, who worked with him, and they took one of these naval war game boards that they laid out on the floor of his living room, and then they would toss dice. And then the story would progress and the operations would happen as the dice dictated, unless the outcome simply was unacceptable. And then they throw the dice again.
How close was Clancy when his books? I think the movies don't do his books justice. I'll give him that. But the books are incredibly well written. But how good was his work? I mean, obviously you've read some of it.
I have read all of his Jack Ryan novels. I have avoided the tactical this and the tactical that.
Right.
Because they were clearly being co-written, and just he had a gravy train and he was working it. He at least from the submarine aspect, which I knew best, he was as accurate as you can get. The most accurate of the submarine novels out there, except for mine.
Gosh. Well, you've led a very interesting life, because Operation Ivy Bills is not the only interesting story. I mean, you've spent time in the Antarctic and in the Arctic. Let's talk about those two chapters in your actual life here.
Okay. After I completed the Ivy Bells episode of my life, I ran into a group of officers from the NOAA Corps. That's the Old Coast and Geodetic Survey. They seemed to be doing interesting things. And after I checked with people, I found out that I could transfer my commission, and I did. And I ended up as an officer in the NOAA Corps, and almost immediately thereafter found myself up in the Arctic, in the ice pack, conducting research. And over 4 years, I spent the better part of 3 years up in the ice pack as a part of a program called the Outer Continental Shelf Environmental Assessment Program, OCSAP. The purpose was to establish a baseline before the first big oil spill. And when that was over, I found myself down on the equator on another research ship. We were checking out the feasibility of commercial mining for manganese nodules down on the bottom of the ocean at about a 5-kilometer depth. These manganese nodules are scattered all over the place, anywhere from the size of an egg up to half the size of a basketball. Mm-hmm. And we checked that out for a year. And then I had the opportunity to be in charge of the National Science Foundation atmospheric projects at the South Pole. I jumped at it and spent a year at the geographic South Pole doing real science.
I mean, you've literally been places nobody else is ever going to go. So you have written about a lot of these things. So let me go back. Let me go back to the oil spill situation. Read one piece, a thing that you've written, about the Exxon Valdez as an example, and of course that was an environmental tragedy, but you sort of speak to the fact that the environment, recovers fairly. It's fairly resilient.
Not only that, it was an environmental tragedy, but we had people in the media and some self-serving, I'll call them scientists in quotes, who were talking about this being the worst oil spill in history. It wasn't even close. It was somewhere down around 60 or 70 in the list, way down there. And there was more damage caused by the cleanup than by the actual.
Did we learn anything in the cleanup process that we're doing now that maybe we're doing less harm in the cleanup now?
Yeah, I think we did. One of the things we focused on in that cleanup was using high pressure steam wands to wash the oil off the beach. And what was happening is we were liquefying the fairly thick oil and forcing it down into the substrata where all the little critters were growing. Mm-hmm. We killed a whole bunch of them, and if we had just left it alone, the stuff would have washed into the water and ended up on the bottom and gotten
silted. We were exacerbating the problem
We exacerbated it. Another thing that we learned not to do, we spread detergent on the oil that was floating. It made it disappear to our eyes, but what it did was cause it to dissolve into the water so that the fish started taking it through their gills. And we did a big a lot of damage to the fish population that wasn't necessary. Because the water was cold, the oil would have congealed and again, sunk to the bottom and been covered by detritus in 1 or 2 years and no longer been a problem.
What is it like living at the South Pole? I mean, one thing, the sun goes around the opposite direction, I imagine, but at least what we're accustomed to. But gosh, a year at the South Pole, 3 months of total darkness, maybe longer.
Yeah, it's 3 months of darkness, 3 months of twilight, 3 months of sunlight, and 3 months of twilight. The sun rises to 23.5 degrees above the horizon. That's as far as it gets. What's it like? Well, the altitude is just under 10,000 feet.
Really?
So we're talking thin air, not a lot of oxygen. And it's cold. We got down, in fact, we hit a temperature during my year there that is the lowest that has yet been recorded there, which was 117.8 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. At that temperature, carbon dioxide crystallizes out of the air and falls as snow.
Huh. And were you actually able to venture out and weather that cold? No.
Every single day.
Every single day.
Yeah, I had a lab that was 200 yards northward. Of course, everything is northward there, but toward the wind.
Yeah, head north.
There's a constant wind blowing, and it was up into the wind, 200 yards from the main complex and about 100 yards from the furthest extension of that complex. And I had to go there every day. I would walk through, it was a corrugated metal tunnel that was filled with fuel bladders. And I would walk through that and get out to my lab. And there was always somebody, one of us was there all the time. And that's where we did the data collection and analysis.
Of all the places you've been in the world, I mean, is there just one spot that just, it's your favorite place you've ever been in all of these travels?
Oh my. Perhaps the island of Tahiti.
Okay. All right. Let's go back to the diving for a second. In the very beginning of the Ivy Bell's book, the diver encounters a giant sea squid, several of them, and diving at depths of close to 1,000 feet, I think.
Yeah, that was
it.
And
actually, this has some ties to a true story, a little bit of a different spin on it, but can you share?
Sure. First off, these are called Humboldt squid. Their typical size of the body, not counting the tentacles, is 6 to 8 feet. And then the tentacles stretch out another 5 feet or so. They have exceedingly sharp jaws. It's sort of like an eagle's beak, but way, way more powerful. And it's right in the center of the tentacles. These guys.
How big is their beak? Is it the size of your?
Like that?
Big. You could take a chunk, right?
It could take, if he opens it up, he can take a head inside and crush it.
Goodness.
So you don't want to get your head in there. But these guys, remember in the movie Jurassic Park, how the raptors, they communicated with each other with a chittering and then they have a coordinated attack?
You're right.
Well, it turns out that Humboldt squid do exactly the same thing, except they communicate with color. And the colors will ripple through their bodies and you can sit there.
But there isn't that much light at that depth. How do they see
the colors? Are there. It's kind of fluorescent. You can actually see it. It's looks like the Northern Lights or the astral light.
And you have witnessed this.
Oh yes,
firsthand.
Right. Yep. And what they'll do, you'll see the colors changing, and then when the colors reach, if they're all blue or all yellow or all red, they attack.
Okay. You were testing suits and actually trying to encourage them to attack. Is that correct?
That is correct. We were testing a special suit made out of mail. It's the ones we used were stainless steel. I think I would prefer doing it with titanium because you could feel the effect of the suckers through the mail. when they'd wrap around the arm before you cut the tentacle off.
This is, were you of right mind when you were doing this? I mean, this just sounds like, okay, we're going to drop you down here. We're going to let the sea creatures attack you. And obviously the armor system worked because you're here to tell the story, but that's pretty exciting stuff.
Well, let me give you some thoughts I had, not then, but at the South Pole. There had been about 60 people there during the summer, and it finally came time for everybody to leave but the 17 of us who would be spending the next 9 months in isolation at the pole. And by isolation, I mean there's no radio except sometime shortwave communications. We could catch a ham operator somewhere and talk with them.
This is, I mean, there's been more than one horror movie made out of this exact situation.
So anyway, the National Science Foundation rep, a real pleasant guy, he sat down with the 17 of us and he says, okay, guys, this is your last chance. Right now, you can make a decision not to go and nobody will think the worst of it. Yeah, right. But you got to make your choice now. Well, we all stayed. And then the folks who were leaving went out, got in the C-130. The C-130 starts moving down the runway. And I'm standing on a little hump of snow by myself, looking at this plane leave and thinking, Robert, you have done a lot of crazy things in your life, but this beats all.
Yeah, I bet. Did you have family at this point? I mean, this is kind of a hardship tour at that point in time, isn't it?
It is. I had a wife and a son, Jason,
right,
who was attending the Fishburne Military Institute in Virginia at the time.
Right.
And at some point, we set up with a ham radio operator who went to the school and set up his stuff. And they had an assembly, and Jason's dad got to talk to him and all of his school buds from the South Pole. That was pretty cool.
Would have been nice to have Zoom, right?
They have it now.
They have it now. I'm sure they do. So, gosh, you got me so interested in all this kind of stuff. So what, you do some teaching?
I did a lot of diving teaching. I taught, for example, the city of Seattle police department. I taught advanced diving to them for their activities on Lake Washington.
Mm-hmm.
I've taught over the years something like 3,000 people the principles of either basic or advanced diving.
When did you discover you were an author? I've always been fascinated. I've had a number of people that have written books on the program, and how did the light come on, and when did you decide to write novels?
When I was a teenager, I wrote a science fiction story and sent it to Analog Science Fact and Fiction. And the editor, bless his heart, wrote me a letter back and said, you got a ways to go, kid, but keep at it.
Uh-huh.
And so I kept at it. I worked on it on and off during my enlisted years. And then eventually I put together the book you talked about, which is not a novel, The Chicken Little Agenda, Debunking Expert Lies.
Right.
That was a compilation of columns, a syndicated column that I had published throughout the Pacific Northwest. But always in the back of my mind was Operation Ivy Bells. And finally, I sat down and put the story together, and we got it out there, and it became a bestseller, which was kind of cool. And the second book, you haven't even mentioned it yet, but the second book, called Operation Icebreaker, takes the same people on a newly modified special ops submarine, still back in that time frame, in this case, the early and mid 1980s. And they go up into the Arctic ice pack to lay a couple of SOSUS arrays in the areas where up until then, we didn't have the ability to detect Soviet subs coming down from the north. And it tells the story of that being dogged by some of the best the Soviets had, Alphas and Sierra submarines. And the third book that I just completed just last week, it's getting ready to go to the publisher, picks up from that story. Through a series of events, one of the Alpha submarines is seriously damaged and the crew has to leave. They have to abandon it. And the Soviets have special capsules on their submarines that allow a crew to escape. They're sort of escape pods. And our guys take it over and then manage to get it working and bring it back to Groton, Connecticut, the submarine base and electric boat from General Dynamics under the Arctic ice pack, with the Soviets dogging them all the way, doing their best to either get it back or sink it.
Okay. It is, so you've just published this book. If you got further plans for additional episodes here, is Mac McDowell's going to keep coming back?
There is a fourth episode that is in outline form now called Whiteout, Operation Whiteout, where Mac and his team and the Toothus are going to lay SOSUS arrays off the coast of Antarctica, looking up into the Atlantic and the Pacific. And while down there, they discover an underwater habitat that is an autonomous habitat that is siphoning oil from a find and putting it into automated submarines, tanker submarines, to take back to Taiwan. This is back in the days when Taiwan was just getting a handle on itself. We had abandoned them, and they were doing their best to work against the Red Chinese. And this story plays the politics of that against the Soviets and the Chinese and the North Koreans and Mac and his team and the Toothus.
Gosh, I do these things and 30 to 35 minutes goes by like that. Robert, I want to have you back on the program in the future when you get the next episode published, and we want to talk a little bit in more depth about your book. Would you be willing to come back when that thing's ready to go to the press and out on Amazon?
Twist my arm.
Twist my arm. There you go. And how do people get in touch with you? What's the best way for them to reach you?
My email is rgw, my initials, at robertwilliscroft.com. My book website is robertwilliscroft.com. And from there, you can go to my personal website. You can find out more than you ever wanted to know about me and the stuff.
All of these books are available on Amazon, and they're Kindle versions, and they're actually audiobook versions of them.
Yeah, you got hard and soft, Kindle, and audio. Right now, we are in the middle of creating the audio version for Operation Icebreaker. My publisher does a very interesting thing. Remember back in the day, the radio shows like the Copalong Cassidy and the Lone Ranger, and well, we do the audio version just like that. We have the sounds, the submarine sounds, and the fish sounds, and the whale sounds, the whole bit. It's all in the right where it has to be. It's really quite fascinating, but it's a bit time consuming.
I hope, has anybody ever talked about making a screenplay out of any of these books? I mean, have you gotten that far?
Yes, we have. We've got a couple of feelers that we're playing out. A connection I made through Ring Knocker is one of them. And
that'd be fantastic. I think that people would be fascinated with the story and actually see some of the technology and that sort of thing that is now literally 50 years old, but just a fantastic story. Well, we've been listening to Robert Williscroft. I would encourage everybody to look on Amazon and look on his website and look at his book. Look for Operation Ivy Bill. Robert, thanks for being the guest and for stepping into the spotlight on the VeteranCrowd Network.
Hey, it's really my pleasure, and it makes it all the more special because it's the VeteranCrowd Network.
There you go. Well, I really appreciate it. Well, the VeteranCrowd Network, we air the spotlight on Tuesdays and Fridays, and we're bringing veterans that are making a real difference in our community to you every week. Robert, thank you so much. Bravo Zulu to you, the Army shout out, and that's a wrap.
Thank you for listening to Spotlight by VeteranCrowd. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and uploads, please visit our website at veterancrowdnetwork.com. We'll see you next time.